let me tell you something, George. I'm going to that art class, and I like this picture. In fact, I like it so much, I'm going to put it right over here.
From a failed spin-off that lasted only 4 episodes to a signature strut born from on-set clowning around, the Jeffersons packed more bizarre behind-the-scenes moments than you'd ever imagine. The groundbreaking sitcom featured everything from a fried chicken controversy to an actor diagnosed with a rare disease by an audience member, not to mention a cast that learned their show was canceled by reading newspapers and watching Entertainment Tonight. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about the Jeffersons. Fact 1. The show was inspired by Black Panthers.
I never carry cash. Here. Thanks.
The creation of the Jeffersons came about through one of the most unexpected moments in television history, when 3 members of the Black Panther Party walked into Norman Lear's office at CBS with a very specific complaint about how African Americans were being portrayed on network television. The producer later recalled in his autobiography that these 3 men were actually fans of his work, but they had serious concerns about the representation they were seeing on shows like Good Times, which was also one of Lear's productions and a spin-off of his series Maude. According to Lear's recollection, the group told him in very direct terms that every time you see a black man on the tube, he is dirt poor, wears terrible clothes, and can't afford nothing. And they made it clear that this was unacceptable. The men pointed out that while shows like Good Times focused on the struggles of a poor family living in the Chicago housing projects, there were no shows depicting successful, affluent African-American families who had achieved financial success and were living comfortable, upper-class lives. This criticism struck a chord with Lear, who consulted with his associate Al Burton about the concept and began developing what would become the Jeffersons. The idea was revolutionary for its time because it would show a black family that had genuinely moved on up in the world, living in a deluxe apartment in Manhattan's Upper East Side, surrounded by wealth and success, rather than poverty and struggle. George Jefferson would be a successful entrepreneur who owned a chain of dry cleaning stores, providing a completely different narrative from what was typically shown on television at that time. This direct intervention from the Black Panthers essentially shaped the entire premise of the show, leading to a series that would run for 11 seasons and become one of the longest-running sitcoms with a predominantly African-American cast in television history. Fact 2. Sherman Hemsley was almost impossible to find.
I ever saw. You look just like me.
When Norman Lear decided he wanted Sherman Hemsley to play George Jefferson on All in the Family, he faced an unexpected challenge that had nothing to do with negotiations or scheduling conflicts. The problem was much simpler and far more frustrating. Nobody could actually find the actor. Hemsley was touring with the Broadway musical Purlie at the time, traveling from city to city across the country, and in the early 1970s, tracking down a touring actor wasn't as simple as sending a quick text message or email. According to Jay Hammer, who later played Alan Willis on The Jeffersons, the casting team's attempts to reach Hemsley turned into something of a comedy of errors. Every time they managed to track down which city Hemsley was performing in and tried to contact him, he had already moved on to the next stop on the tour. By the time someone would call the theater or try to leave a message, Hemsley would be hundreds of miles away in another state, performing for a completely different audience. This cat and mouse game went on for quite some time, with the production team always seeming to be one step behind the constantly moving actor. Lear was so determined to have Hemsley in the role that he made an unusual decision. Rather than simply casting someone else who was easier to reach, he decided to wait for Hemsley to become available and created a workaround in the meantime. The solution was to write in a different character altogether, George's brother Henry Jefferson, played by Mel Stewart. Henry appeared on All in the Family as a temporary stand-in, allowing the show to reference the Jefferson family without actually having George appear on screen. This persistence eventually paid off when Hemsley finished his Broadway run and finally became available. He joined the cast of All in the Family in the show's 4th season, making his first appearance in an episode titled Henry's Farewell, which also marked the last time viewers would see the temporary brother character. The two actors even shared one brief scene together before Henry Jefferson disappeared from the series forever, never to be mentioned again on The Jeffersons. Fact 3. George's iconic strut was an accident.
Big deal. Look, Jefferson Cleaners only needs one computer.
One of the most memorable elements of The Jeffersons was George Jefferson's signature walk, that cocky side-to-side strut that Sherman Hemsley used whenever his character entered a room or walked down the hallway of his deluxe apartment building. What most viewers don't realize is that this iconic movement was never written into the script and wasn't something Hemsley planned from the beginning. The famous walk actually happened completely by accident during the filming of an early episode when the cast was getting tired of doing multiple takes of the same scene. According to Hemsley himself in interviews, the strut came about during a scene where the cast kept going into the Jeffersons' apartment building over and over again. After doing 7 or 8 takes of the same entrance, the actors started getting a bit punchy and began clowning around between shots to keep things light and fun on set. Hemsley drew inspiration from his experiences growing up in South Philadelphia, where he said young men would walk with a certain swagger to show confidence and importance. As he explained it, the attitude was, "You think you're bad, you gotta be important." And that's exactly how the guys in his neighborhood carried themselves on the streets. During one of those later takes, Hemsley decided to exaggerate that street walk he remembered from his youth, swaying from side to side with an over-the-top confident bounce in his step. The crew and other actors found it so perfectly suited to George Jefferson's character and personality that the directors decided to keep that particular take. From that moment on, the strut became an essential part of George Jefferson's character, appearing in the opening credits and countless episodes throughout the show's 11-season run. The walk was so distinctive and popular that it even inspired a dance move in some neighborhoods, with people calling it the George Jefferson and mimicking Hemsley's signature swagger at parties and gatherings throughout the 1970s and 80s. Fact 4. Isabel Sanford almost quit over fried chicken.
No, we were trying to give you a chance to work at a job to make something of yourself.
When Isabel Sanford was first offered the role of Louise Jefferson on All in the Family, she nearly walked away from what would become the opportunity of a lifetime because of a bucket of fried chicken. The incident happened early in the casting process, when Sanford arrived at her dressing room and found a bucket of fried chicken waiting for her. And given the era and the deeply racist stereotypes that existed in the 1970s about African Americans and their supposed favorite foods, Sanford immediately felt insulted and disrespected. She saw the bucket as a deliberate racial slight, a coded message that reinforced harmful stereotypes rather than a welcoming gesture, and her initial reaction was to turn down the role entirely rather than work with people who would treat her that way. The misunderstanding nearly cost television one of its most beloved characters, but producer Norman Lear stepped in to clear things up before Sanford made her final decision. Lear personally assured Sanford that the fried chicken was nothing more than a genuine gift with absolutely no ulterior meaning or racist intent behind it, explaining that it was simply meant as a kind gesture from the production team who wanted to make her feel welcome. After Lear's sincere explanation and reassurance, Sanford reconsidered and decided to take the role, though the incident left a lasting impression on her about how careful productions needed to be about cultural sensitivity and awareness. This near miss highlights just how different the entertainment industry was in the early 1970s and how actors of color had to navigate situations that white actors never faced. Sanford's initial suspicion wasn't paranoia, but rather a reasonable response based on decades of Hollywood's history of racial insensitivity and stereotyping. Fortunately, she gave the show a chance, and her portrayal of Louise Jefferson would go on to earn her 7 consecutive Emmy nominations and 1 win in 1981, making her the first African-American actress to win an Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series. Fact 5. Wheezy was based on Hemsley's real crush.
It was me he was making passes at. And you, Weezy?
One of the most endearing aspects of the Jeffersons was George Jefferson's affectionate nickname for his wife, Louise, whom he lovingly called Wheezy throughout the show's 11-season run. What most fans don't realize is that this iconic nickname wasn't something the writers dreamed up in a script meeting, but rather came from a very real and personal moment in Sherman Hemsley's own past that accidentally found its way onto the set. When Sherman Hemsley was growing up in South Philadelphia, there was a young girl in his neighborhood named Louise who captured his attention and became the object of his teenage affections. Being a young man with a crush, Hemsley developed his own special nickname for her, calling her Wheezy as a term of endearment. The name stayed with him long after those youthful days in Philadelphia had passed, becoming one of those small memories that people carry with them throughout their lives. Years later, while working on the set of All in the Family and later The Jeffersons, Hemsley was performing a scene with his television wife, Isabel Sanford, when something unexpected happened. During what should have been a routine take, the nickname Wheezy just slipped out naturally as Hemsley addressed Sanford's character. It was one of those genuine, unscripted moments where an actor's real life briefly intersected with their fictional role. Rather than calling for another take or correcting the ad-lib, the producers and director recognized that the nickname had a warm, genuine quality that perfectly captured George's affection for Louise, despite his often gruff exterior. Hemsley then approached executive producer Don Nichol about making it official, suggesting that George should call Louise by this nickname going forward. Nichol agreed to the idea, and Isabel Sanford herself liked how it sounded and felt natural coming from Hemsley. From that moment on, Wheezy became an integral part of the show's dialogue and one of the most memorable aspects of George and Louise's relationship, all because of a childhood crush in Philadelphia that Sherman Hemsley never quite forgot. Fact 6. Lionel was played by 3 different actors.
Could I get by without a hassle tonight? I was wrong about school and everything. I'm sorry, okay?
The character of Lionel Jefferson holds a unique distinction in television history as one of the few sitcom characters to be portrayed by 3 completely different actors across multiple shows. The journey of who played George and Louise's son is surprisingly complicated and reflects the behind-the-scenes chaos that sometimes happens in television production. The very first person to play Lionel was an actor named D'Urville Martin, who appeared in 2 unaired test pilots for All in the Family before the show even made it to television. These early versions never saw the light of day, so most viewers have no idea Martin was ever involved with the character. Once All in the Family actually premiered in 1971, the role went to Mike Evans, who became the face of Lionel for audiences across America. Evans played the character for 5 years on All in the Family and continued when the Jeffersons spun off in 1975, making him the definitive Lionel in most people's minds. However, after just 1 season of the Jeffersons, Mike Evans made the surprising decision to leave the show to focus on his writing career. He had co-created the hit sitcom Good Times with Eric Monte, and writing became his primary passion. This meant producers needed to recast Lionel, and they brought in Damon Evans, who was not related to Mike Evans despite sharing the same last name. Damon took over the role during seasons 2, 3, and 4 of The Jeffersons, playing the character from 1976 through 1978. The story gets even stranger when Mike Evans decided to return to acting and rejoined The Jeffersons in season 5, reclaiming the role of Lionel that he had originated years earlier. He stayed with the show from 1979 until the series ended in 1985, making him both the first and last actor to play the character. This kind of casting shuffle was extremely unusual for a successful primetime sitcom, and it remains one of the most peculiar casting decisions in television history. Fact 7. The opening credits were a Hollywood trick.
Louise, do you have your acceptance speech ready?
Well, just in case.
If you've ever watched The Jeffersons, you probably remember that iconic opening sequence where George and Louise step out of a yellow cab and confidently walk through the doors of their fancy Manhattan apartment building while that unforgettable theme song plays. For decades, viewers naturally assumed they were watching the real building in New York City from start to finish. But the truth is far more interesting than that. The scene where the Jeffersons actually exit the cab and enter the building wasn't filmed in New York at all. It was shot in Santa Monica, California, and then cleverly edited together with footage of the actual New York building to create what appeared to be one seamless sequence. The real building used for the exterior shots is called Park Lane Towers, located at 185 East 85th Street on Manhattan's Upper East Side. This impressive high-rise with its distinctive balconies became instantly recognizable to millions of viewers every week, and the production team did film genuine footage of this building for the opening credits. However, when it came time to shoot the close-up scenes of Sherman Hemsley and Isabel Sanford getting out of the taxi and walking through the entrance, the producers made a practical decision to film those moments much closer to their Hollywood studios. There are actually several clues that give away this trick if you look closely enough. The New York building features a revolving door at its entrance, but in the opening credits, you can see a doorman holding open a regular door for George and Louise to walk through. Another telling detail is the taxi itself. The cab that pulls up to the building has a black roof, but when George and Louise step out, they're exiting from a different taxi altogether. The New York Times eventually documented this fascinating behind-the-scenes detail, confirming what sharp-eyed viewers had suspected for years. It's a perfect example of the magic of television production, where careful editing and smart camera work can make viewers believe they're watching one continuous scene when they're actually seeing footage from two locations nearly 3,000 miles apart. Fact 8. Paul Benedict was diagnosed by an audience member.
Hey, Mr. Bentley.
Oh, you seem a bit tired this morning.
I am. Did you ever have one of those nights when you didn't sleep a wink?
Paul Benedict, who played the eccentric British neighbor Harry Bentley on The Jeffersons, spent years struggling with a mysterious medical condition that no doctor could properly diagnose. Starting in high school, Benedict began experiencing unusual and disproportionate growth in certain parts of his body, including his nose, jaw, hands, and feet. The changes were noticeable enough to affect his appearance, yet despite visiting multiple doctors and specialists, no one could figure out what was causing this abnormal development. Benedict lived with this puzzling condition for years, going through his early career without any real answers about what was happening to his body. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected way imaginable, not in a doctor's office or hospital, but during a performance on Broadway. While Benedict was on stage performing, an audience member noticed something unusual about his physical features and felt compelled to speak with him after the show. This wasn't just any random theatergoer making an observation. The person happened to be a radiologist with specialized medical training. After the performance ended, the radiologist approached Benedict and explained that based on what he had observed during the show, Benedict appeared to be exhibiting classic symptoms of acromegaly, a rare hormonal disorder caused by abnormal growth hormone production. Acromegaly occurs when the pituitary gland produces too much growth hormone, typically due to a benign tumor, and it leads to the gradual enlargement of body parts, particularly the bones in the face, hands, and feet. Armed with this information from a stranger in a theater audience, Benedict finally had a name for his condition and could seek proper treatment. He underwent a 20-minute surgical procedure that successfully stopped the progression of the disorder. This bizarre twist of fate, being diagnosed by an audience member rather than a medical professional during a formal examination, gave Benedict the answers he had been searching for throughout his youth and early adulthood, allowing him to finally address a condition that had puzzled him and his doctors for years. Fact 9. The failed spin-off ended in a fire.
Great. In fact, let's hear it twice.
Bourbon, you got it.
After 6 successful seasons of The Jeffersons, CBS executives were so confident in the show's popularity that they decided to give the sassy maid Florence Johnston her own series in 1981. Florence, played by Marla Gibbs, had become a fan favorite with her sharp wit and constant verbal sparring with George Jefferson, so a spin-off seemed like a sure bet. The new show was called Checking In, and it followed Florence as she left the Jefferson household to become the executive housekeeper at a fancy Manhattan hotel called the St. Frederick. The premise seemed promising enough, with Florence managing a staff of eccentric hotel employees, including her stuffy boss, played by Larry Linville, who had just finished his run as Frank Burns on MASH. The show premiered on April 9th, 1981, airing on Thursday nights, but right from the start, things didn't go well. Checking In struggled to find an audience, and the chemistry that made Florence so funny on The Jeffersons just didn't translate to her new workplace setting. One major problem was that since the hotel owner specifically hired Florence for the job, her boss didn't really have the power to fire her, which removed a lot of the tension that made her relationship with George Jefferson so entertaining. The ratings were dismal, and CBS pulled the plug after just 4 episodes, making it one of the shortest-lived spin-offs in television history and the first failure in the entire All in the Family franchise. When Florence returned to the Jeffersons, the writers needed to explain where she had been and why she was back, so they came up with a perfectly absurd solution. Florence showed up at the Jefferson apartment looking disheveled with singed clothing, explaining that the St. Frederick Hotel had burned down in a fire, and she barely escaped with her life. The hotel burning to the ground was mentioned only briefly, happening completely off camera, and just like that, Florence was back to her old job as if nothing had happened. The whole failed experiment lasted less than a month on the air, but at least the fictional fire gave viewers a memorable explanation for why their favorite maid came home. Fact 10. CBS moved the show 15 times.
We're not?
Nope.
We're having a party for you!
The Jeffersons endured one of the most chaotic scheduling experiences in television history, changing time slots at least 15 different times during its 11-year run on CBS. This constant shuffling was extremely unusual for such a popular and successful series, and it created a roller coaster ride of ratings that frustrated both the cast and the show's producers. The network seemed to use The Jeffersons as a programming chess piece, moving it around the schedule as if they were trying to solve a puzzle or fill gaps in their lineup, rather than allowing the show to build a consistent audience in one reliable time slot. When The Jeffersons premiered in January 1975, it quickly became a hit, ranking number 4 in its first season. The show initially aired on Saturday nights as part of CBS's legendary lineup that included All in the Family, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Bob Newhart Show, and The Carol Burnett Show. However, after this strong start, CBS began moving the show around with bewildering frequency. The series bounced between Wednesday nights, Sunday nights, Saturday nights, and even Tuesday nights during its final season. Sunday night became the most common time slot over the years, but the constant changes made it difficult for viewers to keep track of when the show was actually airing. These scheduling changes had a direct impact on the show's ratings, which fluctuated wildly throughout its run. After ranking 4th in Season 1, The Jeffersons dropped to 21st place in Season 2. By Seasons 4 and 5, the show had fallen all the way to 52nd and 49th place, respectively. Then, almost miraculously, the series bounced back to the top 10 in Season 6 and reached its peak at number 3 overall during Season 8, only behind Dallas and 60 Minutes. The show remained in the top 20 for several more seasons, before a mid-season move to Tuesday nights in its final year sent ratings plummeting to 59th place, which ultimately contributed to its cancellation. Some observers noted that it almost seemed like CBS wanted to kill off the show with all these disruptive moves, rather than letting it thrive in a stable time slot where loyal fans could find it week after week. Fact 11. The cast learned about cancellation from newspapers.
Man now, with responsibilities. Besides, you're too old to start flying. No.
After 11 successful seasons on CBS, the Jeffersons came to an abrupt and unceremonious end in 1985, and the way the cast found out about the cancellation was nothing short of disrespectful. Despite being one of the longest-running sitcoms in television history and a cultural phenomenon that had brought CBS consistent ratings success, the network never bothered to inform the cast or crew that their show was being canceled. Instead, the actors who had poured over a decade of their lives into these beloved characters were left to discover the devastating news through second-hand sources, almost as an afterthought. Sherman Hemsley, who had brought George Jefferson to life with his signature strut and comedic timing, learned that the show was canceled when he opened up a newspaper one morning and read the announcement in print. Isabel Sanford, who had won an Emmy for her portrayal of Louise Jefferson and had been nominated 7 consecutive times, found out from her cousin who had read about the cancellation in a tabloid magazine. Franklin Cover, who played Tom Willis and was part of television's first interracial couple, discovered the news while watching Entertainment Tonight, a television entertainment news program. The final episode, titled Red Robins, aired on July 2, 1985, and was never intended to serve as a series finale at all. The cast had gone on hiatus after filming wrapped, assuming they would return for a 12th season, completely unaware that CBS had already announced the cancellation to advertisers nearly 2 months earlier during their upfront presentation in May. Isabel Sanford later publicly called the lack of a proper finale disrespectful on the part of CBS, expressing her disappointment that after so many years of dedication to the show, neither she nor her castmates were given the opportunity to say goodbye to their characters or to the millions of fans who had followed the Jeffersons' journey from Queens to their deluxe apartment in the sky. The cast never got the chance to film a proper send-off, leaving both the performers and the audience without the closure they deserved after such a groundbreaking and influential series. Fact 12. Isabel Sanford was 21 years older than Sherman.
Well, look, Weezy. About the permit.
We know all about it, George.
You do?
Yes.
When Sherman Hemsley was first cast to play George Jefferson opposite Isabel Sanford's Louise, there was an unusual problem that had nothing to do with acting ability and everything to do with simple mathematics. Isabel Sanford was born in 1917, while Sherman Hemsley wasn't born until 1938, making her a full 21 years older than the man who would play her television husband for over a decade. When Sanford first met Hemsley at the studio, she was taken aback by how young he looked compared to her, and she seriously doubted whether audiences would buy them as a married couple who had been together for years and raised a son. The age difference became even more apparent during their first meeting, which happened in a somewhat awkward way. An assistant asked Sanford to escort this young man upstairs to meet director John Rich, and when Rich introduced Hemsley as her future co-star, Sanford was genuinely shocked. She had expected someone closer to her own age, not someone who could have realistically been her own son. Despite her initial reservations, the producers were confident that Hemsley was the right choice for George Jefferson, and they convinced Sanford to trust their vision for the show. As it turned out, Sanford's concerns were completely unfounded, because once the cameras started rolling, the chemistry between her and Hemsley was undeniable. Their performances were so convincing and their timing together so natural that audiences never questioned the age gap for a moment. The dynamic between them became one of the most beloved aspects of the Jeffersons, with their bickering, reconciliations, and genuine affection for each other forming the emotional heart of the series. Hemsley and Sanford developed such a strong working relationship that the cast and crew gave them affectionate nicknames, calling Sanford the Queen because of her regal bearing and calling Hemsley the Neck because of his slender build. Their friendship extended beyond the show, and they continued working together in commercials and reunion appearances long after the Jeffersons ended, proving that sometimes the most unlikely pairings create the most memorable television magic. Fact 13. Marla Gibbs kept her day job for 2 years.
Almost 4 years. And this is the second biggest surprise I can think of.
Oh yeah, what's the first?
That I could put up with you for 4 years.
When Marla Gibbs was cast as Florence Johnston, the sharp-tongued maid on the Jeffersons, she made a decision that might seem surprising for someone landing a role on what would become one of television's most beloved sitcoms. Despite being offered a part on a Norman Lear production, which was essentially a golden ticket in the 1970s television landscape, Gibbs refused to quit her day job at United Airlines, where she worked as a reservation agent. In fact, she continued working for the airline through the show's early seasons, keeping her regular employment for about 2 years after the Jeffersons premiered in January of 1975. This wasn't a matter of Gibbs lacking confidence in her acting abilities or not taking the role seriously. Instead, it was a practical and somewhat prophetic decision based on her understanding of how unpredictable the entertainment industry could be. Florence was originally intended to be just a recurring character, not a series regular, which meant Gibbs had no guarantee of steady work or income from the show. She had bills to pay and responsibilities to meet, and the security of a regular paycheck from United Airlines was simply too important to give up on the gamble that a supporting television role might turn into something more substantial. Her caution proved wise in some ways, as television series could be canceled at any moment, and even successful shows didn't always provide financial security for every cast member. Gibbs had watched enough actors struggle between jobs to know that keeping her airline position was the smart move. What she couldn't have predicted was just how popular her character would become with audiences. Florence's witty comebacks and her hilarious verbal sparring matches with George Jefferson quickly made her a fan favorite, and producers recognized her value by eventually promoting her to a series regular. Only after the show's success became undeniable and her role was secured did Gibbs finally feel comfortable leaving United Airlines behind to focus fully on her acting career. Her practical approach to managing her career turned out to be both wise and unnecessary, but it showed the kind of level-headed thinking that served her well throughout her long career in entertainment. Fact 14. The hallway set had a major design flaw.
Why don't we invite Tom and Helen down for dinner tonight?
If you watched the Jeffersons closely enough, you might have noticed something odd about the apartment building's layout that never quite made sense. Throughout the entire 11-season run of the show, characters would regularly exit the Jefferson family's apartment and turn left into the hallway. But according to the established floor plan, this would have sent them walking straight into their neighbor Harry Bentley's front door instead of toward the elevator. This bizarre continuity error appeared in episode after episode, year after year, and somehow nobody ever caught it or bothered to fix it during production. The layout of the set was pretty straightforward according to what viewers could see in various episodes. Harry Bentley's apartment was positioned at the end of the hallway, just a couple of feet away at the corner on the left side of the Jeffersons' apartment door. The elevator, which characters were presumably trying to reach when they left, was located straight across from the Jeffersons' entrance. So logically, anyone leaving the apartment should have walked straight ahead or turned right to get to the elevator. But instead, cast members would consistently turn left and walk directly toward where Bentley's door was supposed to be. What makes this even more peculiar is that The Jeffersons was filmed on a soundstage in Hollywood with carefully constructed sets, so the crew had complete control over the layout and could have easily fixed this issue at any point during the show's production. The mistake wasn't just a one-time slip either. It happened numerous times throughout the course of the series, suggesting that either the directors didn't notice the problem, or they simply didn't think viewers would pay close enough attention to the apartment building's geography to catch the error. It's one of those small details that once you notice it, you can't help but see it every single time a character walks out that door. Fact 15. Roxy Roker showed producers a photo to get cast.
Can we please have a big hand for our Volunteer of the Year?
When Roxy Roker walked into her casting interview for the Jeffersons, the producers had an unusual question for her, and her response became one of the most memorable moments in the show's casting history. The role of Helen Willis was groundbreaking because she would be part of television's first interracial married couple on a sitcom, and the producers needed to make sure their actress would be comfortable portraying this relationship on screen. So during the interview, they asked Roker directly if she would feel comfortable playing a character who was married to a white man, given the controversial nature of interracial relationships on television in the mid-1970s. Without saying a word, Roker simply reached into her purse, pulled out a photograph, and handed it to the producers. The photo showed her real-life husband, Cy Kravitz, who was white and Jewish. The producers immediately understood that not only would she be comfortable with the role, but she was actually living this reality in her own life, which meant she could bring authentic experience and perspective to the character of Helen Willis. Cy Kravitz worked as a television producer at NBC News, and he and Roxy had been married since 1962, more than a decade before The Jeffersons even premiered. Their marriage during that era was still considered taboo in many parts of America, and they faced their share of challenges and discrimination in real life, experiences that Roxy would later channel into her portrayal of Helen. The couple had one son together, a boy named Leonard Albert Kravitz, who would grow up to become the famous musician and actor known simply as Lenny Kravitz. Years later, Lenny would speak publicly about how his mother's role on The Jeffersons held special meaning for their family, as the show addressed many of the same issues his parents faced in their everyday lives. The simple act of showing that photograph not only got Roxy the part, but it also ensured that the groundbreaking interracial couple on The Jeffersons would be portrayed with genuine understanding and lived experience.